For our body to function, we need to eat food. And I think for us to function as artists, as people who create things, we also need a different sort of mental food to sustain that process. And I think that food is the art we consume, the way that we go about consuming the beauty in the world, and just the way we experience life in general, the artistic experience of life. Because then we fill our mind with all of these beautiful ideas, these associations, these symbols, these connections. And then when we sit down to write, or to paint, or to make music, right, we have a world inside our head to draw from, to create something. Now, in the same way, or to extend that metaphor maybe, when we eat very unhealthy food, and it gets bad for our body, and it doesn't function necessarily for the things we might want to do. If you want to run marathons, you probably need to eat more specific things to help you with that goal. If you want to be a bodybuilder and have like massive muscles, you need to have a different diet. And for art, I think the art that we consume and the way that we approach the world has a profound effect on the results we actually get as creators. And I don't see people talking about this very much, or at least not in this way. And you occasionally hear, the advice, the best way to learn how to write is to read, right? If you want to get good at music, listen. And I think that's useful, but then the question becomes, what do I read? What do I listen to? And how do I approach consumption, right? How do I look at the world, listen to the world, approach the world in a way that is conducive for, turning that world into art? And that's a question that has fascinated me for some time, and one that I'm not entirely sure I have, solid answers to, because we never really have those. But I have learned a few things in consuming an immense amount of art and creating a good amount of it too. I read a lot of poems. I listen to a ton of music. For a while I was keeping track of all the songs I listened to, my liked songs on Spotify, though I don't use it anymore, and I think my liked songs playlist had gotten to 20,000 songs. So always listening to more, and looking, for the right thing to listen to that would, help me as an artist. And I think the answer to that question of, what can we consume that helps us as artists is very tied to our goals, right? Going back to the marathon runner and the bodybuilder, you're going to eat very different things to pursue those different, athletic goals and those different physiques. And an artist is very similar. We can take an example of a poet, right? And we'll take a poet who really loves writing poetry, but doesn't really read any poetry at all. Now, they might listen to a lot of music, right? A lot of their favorite singers, and there's language in there and in the lyrics. So they listen to a lot of lyrics, and their mind is full of words that are set to song. And I think that poet will sit down and write poems that reflect that are very musical. I think a poet who spends a lot of time looking at paintings will end up writing very visual poems. A painter who, this is a very obvious example, spends all their time looking at nature will probably find more nature seeping into their art. The painter who spends all their time in the city is at least much more likely to create art that evokes the city, or reflects the city, or has the colors of the city. And understanding that, I think, is very useful. Because then I or you can go ask, right? What kind of art do I want to make? Or what do I want to make right now, or this week, or, for my whole life? And that can inform the way we want to live. It's almost a way to work backward. You can decide, how do I want to make my art? And then how can I live in a way that supports that? Let's say you want to write the most beautiful nature poems. Then that probably tells you should be going out and spending time in nature. Now, if you want to write nature poetry, you probably already are. But then you go into that space and you can start thinking about it as an artistic experience. Going out into the woods or the desert or to the ocean and thinking, where is the art in this? Or just going into it with an open mind to appreciate that beauty as profoundly as possible, knowing that an appreciation of that thing will, passively, ambiently seep into your art. And let's say, you find yourself writing a lot about food, or painting, images of food, still life. Maybe you would approach eating food differently, right? Truly taking that bite with an interest of experiencing as artfully as possible that moment. And then so when you go to paint, the bite of that food, it becomes all the more vivid because that experience is tangible, it's real, it's there, it's accessible to you. That can, take the art from this passive grabbing of symbols, grabbing of the experiences we have, to an active experience that then translates into art making very directly. Now, I want to caution, right? I think there's a danger in thinking like this, right? There's a danger in thinking of experience as something to be precisely molded to make the best art as possible. Because then we get into this space of I must read the most relevant things. I must read the most beautiful poems. I must only go see the things that are relevant to my art. And that's probably counterproductive as well. Because, right, one of those profound beauties of art is the way that we surprise ourselves in expression, the way that things come through, the way that we make connections in unexpected ways. And so we also have to leave some space to, consume art we might not normally, right? To put on a radio station of a genre we don't really like and hear it. To go to a place we might not normally, to talk to a stranger, or to read a poem that we never would have read otherwise. And I think that's where, one of the big things when talking about food and diets is that balance is often a very useful thing, right? Having a balanced diet, having many different things. And we think of these carnivore diets or veganism as very extreme and often very dangerous because you can incur deficiencies. And we don't want to be deficient in something as artists either. And I think that is where, the poet perhaps should spend a great deal of time reading poetry and reading the poetry that might, inspire them the most. But then they probably also want to go listen to music and look at a painting every once in a while and read a novel, and to really experience the world as broadly as possible, to go to the forest but also to go to the city. Because then we can take, more of the world, more of human experience, and channel that into the moment when we sit down and make art, because all of that existence is already there, stored up in our mind, just waiting to be expressed. But there are lots of ways to eat a healthy diet, right? We can have a little bit of everything. We can mostly eat one thing and make sure we're getting enough of the others. We can do a lot of one thing for a while and then kind of switch and then kind of switch. But I do think it's something useful to think about, this relationship. How is what I am consuming contributing to what I am putting out? And particularly in a modern age of distraction and constant consumption, there are all these traps, right? Social media and the internet that wants you to constantly consume something without really feeling it, without really engaging with it, without it being artistic. Because how are you going to be artistic when you're a product? And so those things are maybe to generally be avoided. But also, right, as with balance with diet, it's not going to kill you to eat ice cream every once in a while. But we should be careful, and we should be mindful, right, of what we're putting in, because that affects what we're putting out. And there's no wrong or right way to do it. There's no art that is better or worse than another. This isn't saying, read the classics, because the classics are the best food. No, right? Read those works which inspire you to create. Read those works which help you get closer to the experiences you want to share. And maybe that is the classics, right? But maybe it's fan fiction. Maybe you're a fan fiction writer and you go and read a lot of it because that inspires you. Maybe it's playing video games or listening to pop or country or classical or free jazz or deathcore music. It doesn't really matter what it is, right? That's like different flavors of food. As long as you're enjoying it and it feels nourishing and it gives you the energy to keep creating, then that's good. And we would want to avoid those things, I think, that don't fill us, or that we eat and still feel hungry afterward. Because that's not going to leave us in a place where we are full of ideas and full of things which we can then put on the score or put on the page or put onto the stage, right? Yeah, I think that's about all I have to say about that. But yeah, balance is key and paying attention is key, and understanding, right, fundamentally, that relationship is there. They say like you are what you eat or whatever. And really your art is, right, an expression of your experiences. So live well, right? Eat well. And hopefully you'll have good art on the other end. At very least, you'll be setting yourself up well for that. And that's about as much as you can do.